Georgian Court, Lakewood, New Jersey. A morning in the spring of 1904. On the front lawn of a 156-acre estate, 32 boys in 15th-century armor and court dress are arranged on a grass chessboard 40 feet across. George J. Gould, age 40, stands on the terrace. He calls the moves. The chess pieces do not move themselves. I have gone back to that morning more often than I expected to. George J. Gould was the eldest son of Jay Gould, who was, at the moment of his death in December of 1892, the 9th richest man in the history of the United States. Jay left $72 million to his 6 children, operational control of the family's railroads to George, and not 1 cent to anyone else. George's share alone was $15 million. The man who built the fortune patrolled his estate with armed guards around the clock and left not $1 to charity, servants, or the public when he died. His son received $15 million outright and spent 2 decades blasting a railroad through the Sierra Nevada, building what the press called the last great transcontinental system of the Gilded Age. A 25-year-old section foreman named Leonardo de Tomaso drove the final spike of that railroad with a standard iron spike into a bridge over Spanish Creek in the mountains of Northern California. There was no ceremony. In 1921, George Gould's wife, an actress who had been married to him for 35 years and borne him 7 children, was found dead on the 9th tee of his private golf course. By some accounts, she was wearing a constricting rubber undergarment from ankle to neck. George had by that point fathered 3 additional children with a former chorus girl from Iowa who was performing in London under the stage name Vere Sinclair. His younger siblings sued him for $50 million. They settled for $20 million. George had been dead 4 years by the time the settlement was signed. George died of pneumonia on the French Riviera, 4 months after visiting the newly opened tomb of Tutankhamun. The international press attributed his death to the curse of the pharaohs. The estate he left behind, after debts and litigation, was valued at $5,175,590. His father had left $72 million. These facts are documented. They are also not the whole of the story. This is the story of Jay Gould, who was called the worst man in America, who controlled 15% of American railroad mileage, and who died leaving $72 million exclusively to his 6 children. It is also the story of the son who inherited the largest railroad fortune in American history and spent 20 years chasing a transcontinental dream that cost him nearly everything. I want to start in Lakewood, New Jersey in 1904. Chapter 1. Georgian Court. The lawn. That is the right place to start. Not with the balance sheets or the railroad maps or the receivership filings. With the lawn on a spring morning in 1904, and the 32 boys in 15th century costume arranged on it like chess pieces, because George J. Gould said so. The estate was called Georgian Court. It sat on 156 acres in Lakewood, New Jersey, about a mile from the center of town, purchased by George in 1896 for purposes the local press described, with the careful understatement of the period, as a country residence. The architect was Bruce Price, the New York-based architect who had also designed the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec. The construction ran from 1896 to 1898 and cost a figure that later biographers could not precisely reconstruct. The surviving accounts suggest several million dollars for the main house alone, and considerably more for the grounds. The grounds were the point: 3 polo fields, an indoor riding ring large enough to exercise horses in any weather, a covered tennis court, courts for squash and real tennis, a gymnasium, a swimming pool 56 feet long and 26 feet wide, golf links across a portion of the acreage, a polo stable, and the Italian sunken garden, which required 5,000 cartloads of imported loam to prepare the soil to the standard the design demanded. In the center of the sunken garden stood a marble fountain featuring Apollo on a nautilus shell pulled by winged horses. George had commissioned it in Italy, by some accounts as a birthday gift for his wife Edith in 1900. It was shipped across the Atlantic and installed in the garden. The year George gave Edith a marble fountain the size of a small house, he was the head of one of the largest railroad systems in the United States. Each of their 7 children had a personal pony and a small carriage. George and Edith maintained a mansion in New York City as well, at 857 Fifth Avenue, and a hunting and fishing retreat in the Catskills. The live chess game in the spring of 1904 is documented in press records from Lakewood. George organized it. Boys from the area, costumed in armor and court dress representing the pieces of both sides, moved across a 40-foot grass grid at George's direction from the terrace above. The press described it as a novelty. It was also, in its way, a portrait. I have spent some time trying to picture Jay Gould on that terrace. The image will not form. Jay Gould, who owned Lakewood through the family holdings, and whose fortune paid for every blade of grass and every cartload of imported loam, did not organize live chess games on lawns. Jay Gould kept no public entertainments and no standing invitations. He was famously domestic, private almost to the point of secrecy, devoted to his wife Helen and their 6 children. He purchased the Gothic Revival mansion Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York, in 1880 as a country retreat, and his idea of an afternoon was to walk the grounds with one of his children. He kept armed guards on patrol around the clock. He received almost no one outside his family and his bankers. By the standards of a Gilded Age industrialist who controlled 15% of the nation's railroad mileage, he lived with a restraint that contemporaries found as unsettling as his ruthlessness. His son built an estate that required 5,000 cartloads of imported soil and then gave a birthday gift that had to be shipped from Italy. What Jay built, George inhabited. What Jay restrained, George expressed. What Jay accumulated, George moved through with the confidence of a man who had never needed to accumulate it himself. That contrast is not an accident. It is the whole of what this story is about. The $15 million and the operational control of the railroads and the steam yacht and the Fifth Avenue mansion and the Lakewood estate all passed from one set of hands to another in December of 1892. And the hands they passed into were not the hands that had earned them. There is nothing unusual about this. Dynasties do not arrive with instruction manuals. The question is always whether the second generation builds, holds, or loses. The Gould answer to that question is what the rest of this story is. Georgian Court still stands. After George's death, it went through several owners before the Sisters of Mercy acquired it in 1924. Today, it is Georgian Court University, a Catholic liberal arts college. The Italian sunken garden is a campus landmark. The Apollo marble fountain is still there. The story of how the man who commissioned that fountain lost nearly everything begins not in Lakewood, but in a place considerably smaller, a small dairy farm in upstate New York in the 1830s, where a boy named Jason Gould grew up without a mother and taught himself to read maps. Chapter 2. Roxbury. A small dairy farm in the Catskill foothills near Roxbury, Delaware County, New York, in the 1830s. The soil was thin and stony. The winters ran long. The Catskill upland where the highlands flattened toward the river valleys, was the kind of country where a small farmer in the early 19th century could expect a life of persistent, modest labor with no particular expectation that his children would do any better. Jason Gould was born on May 27, 1836, the youngest of 6 children of John Burr Gould and Mary Moore, the only son among 5 older daughters. His mother died when he was 4 years old. His father remarried. The first stepmother died within roughly 2 years. He remarried again. The second stepmother also died within a similar interval. By the time Jason Gould was a teenager, he had buried his mother and both of his father's subsequent wives. He was not evidently from a family where things held. He attended the Hobart Academy in the region, paying his way as a bookkeeper for a local blacksmith. He was serious at mathematics and taught himself surveying, drawing maps of Delaware County on his own initiative. At Hobart, he entered an essay contest and won a prize for a paper titled "Honesty is the Best Policy." I have come back to that essay title more than once, not to be clever about it. The prize exists in the historical record. The title exists. Jay Gould, at 20 years old, put his name on a paper arguing that honesty was the correct policy and won an award for the position. What he went on to do with that position is also in the historical record, and the distance between the two facts is a distance the rest of this story has to account for. By 20, he had left the academy and entered into a tanning partnership in Pennsylvania, at a place that eventually took the name Gouldsboro, with an established tanner named Zadok Pratt. He subsequently bought Pratt out and entered a second partnership with a leather merchant named Charles Mortimer Loop. The Panic of 1857 arrived. The economy collapsed across the country. Loop, ruined, took his own life 2 years later in 1859. The tanning business fell apart. Gould was in his early 20s, and his second business partner was dead by his own hand. What happened next is where the biographical record gets interesting. Rather than retreating to the Catskills, Gould used the depressed prices of the panic to buy distressed securities in the Rutland and Washington Railroad at something in the vicinity of 10 cents on the dollar. He was taking control of his first railroad at the precise moment when its original owners could no longer afford to hold it. He was not quite 22. He had no patron, no established family name, and no completed formal education. By 1863, he was managing the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad through the connections of Helen Day Miller, whom he married that year. He had met her through her father's involvement in the line. The Rensselaer and Saratoga gave him access to the financial networks of New York City. Through the early 1860s, he traded railroad securities and accumulated positions in multiple smaller lines. The process was not dramatic, it was systematic. By 1865, he was a millionaire. The biography stack on first mention is worth dwelling on, because what Jay Gould was matters to understanding what George Gould was not. Jay had assembled himself from Catskill poverty, self-taught mathematics, 2 failed partnerships, a dead business partner, and an instinct for distressed assets that he had apparently developed before anyone taught him to call it that. By the time he touched the Erie Railroad, the most complicated and contested piece of railroad property in the United States, he had already survived more concentrated economic chaos than most men of his era encountered across a full life. He knew what the bottom looked like. He had been close to it. The Erie Railroad was next. What Jay did with it would fix his public reputation for the rest of his life. You should probably subscribe at this point. It is free, and it is what keeps this going. Chapter 3. The Erie Cornelius Vanderbilt was 64 years old in 1867, the year Jay Gould joined the Erie Railroad Board. He had built a transportation empire from nothing. first on the Hudson River ferries and steamboats of the 1810s and 20s, then through the railroad consolidations of the 1850s and 60s. By 1867, he owned the New York Central, was the dominant power in American rail transportation east of the Great Lakes, and had concluded, with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously stopped, that he would own the Erie as well. The Erie was, in 1867, the most contested railroad property in the country. It had been mismanaged and looted repeatedly since the 1840s, its equipment was neglected, its finances were a running scandal, and its bonds were traded at discounts that reflected a general market opinion that the promises attached to them were not worth the paper they were printed on. What it was, regardless of all that, was one of the 4 trunk lines connecting the American interior to the port of New York. The man who controlled it controlled a meaningful share of the freight tonnage of the northeastern United States. Vanderbilt wanted it. He had simply assumed he would get it. Gould joined the Erie board alongside Daniel Drew, a stock speculator and the company's longtime treasurer who had made a career of using his position to manipulate Erie shares in the market, and James Fisk, a Boston-born promoter of considerable flair and no discernible embarrassment. The 3 of them, against Vanderbilt, had nothing in common except the preference not to be absorbed by him. The mechanism they used to stop Vanderbilt was straightforward in design, regardless of its legal standing. They converted $5 million of convertible Erie bonds into somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 new shares of Erie stock. This was stock dilution, the practice of creating new equity without creating corresponding value, and Vanderbilt's agents in the market, following orders to acquire Erie, kept buying. For every dollar that entered Erie from the Vanderbilt camp, a new share appeared to absorb it. Vanderbilt went to the courts. He obtained an arrest warrant through a judge he controlled, George Barnard of the Tammany Judiciary, and the trio fled the state. They crossed the Hudson to Jersey City with $7 million in cash and certificates, and established headquarters in Taylor's Hotel, which the press promptly renamed the Erie Castle. Guards were posted. Cash was stacked in boxes. Gould and Fisk received visitors and issued cheerful statements and made no move to return to New York. Gould then traveled to Albany. He did not send an intermediary, he went himself. What he brought with him was a satchel containing $500,000 in greenbacks. He distributed the money to legislators and lobbied personally for a special act that would retroactively legalize the bond conversion that Vanderbilt's judges had ruled illegal. One senator, by some accounts, accepted $75,000 from Vanderbilt's representatives and $100,000 from Gould's, kept both payments, and voted for Gould. The special act passed March 4, 1868. Vanderbilt settled in July, having lost an estimated $1 to $2 million. I want to pause on the Albany trip for a moment. The corruption was, by the standards of the period, not exceptional. New York legislators were bought regularly throughout Reconstruction, and the Erie had been used as a vehicle for legislative bribery multiple times before Gould arrived. What is notable is not that it happened, but how. Gould carried the cash personally. He counted out the payments. He appears to have found nothing about this unusual. His own later account, given to the New York State Senate Committee on Labor and Education, clarified his political philosophy in precise terms. In a Republican district, he told the committee, he was a strong Republican. In a Democratic district, he was Democratic. In doubtful districts, he was doubtful. In politics, he said, he was an Erie Railroad man all the time. Gould emerged from the Erie War as the railroad's president. William Boss Tweed, the Tammany machine boss who had orchestrated the Albany legislation through his network, joined the Erie board as a director. The relationship was functional on both sides and lasted until Tweed's own fall in 1871 and Gould's loss of the Erie in 1872, when Fisk was shot dead in a separate dispute and the legal infrastructure Gould had relied on collapsed with the Tammany Ring. The Erie War made Gould a rich man and a master of corporate political mechanics. It also earned him the press hostility that would define his public reputation for the next 25 years. What happened next, the gold panic of September of 1869, would harden that hostility into something the country did not let go of for the rest of his life and did not seriously reconsider for the better part of a century after it. Chapter 4. Black Friday. The New York Gold Room, Lower Manhattan, September 24, 1869. The Gold Room was where, in the years after the Civil War, the price of gold was set by open outcry trading. Gold mattered in 1869 because the federal government had financed the war by issuing paper currency, greenbacks, not convertible to gold. The gold price floated against the paper dollar, and the relationship between the two governed the prices of American exports, particularly wheat, because foreign buyers settling accounts wanted gold and American farmers received dollars. A high gold price benefited exporters and farmers. A low gold price benefited importers and manufacturers. The Treasury controlled the price by releasing gold from the Federal Reserves when prices rose too far. Gould and Fisk had spent the summer of 1869 positioning to corner that market. They accumulated substantial gold positions and worked to ensure that the Treasury would not release its reserves and break the price. The scheme required 2 points of access to the government's intentions. The first was Abel Corbin, President Ulysses Grant's brother-in-law, who agreed to lobby Grant against gold sales. The second was General Daniel Butterfield, newly appointed as Assistant Treasury Secretary in New York, who received a notional investment stake of $1.5 million and a $10,000 personal loan in exchange for advance warning of Treasury actions. Gold rose through August and September. It moved from roughly $132 per ounce to $150, then to $160, then to $162.50 on the morning of September 24th. The Gold Room was beyond ordinary pandemonium. Men were shouting. The price ticked upward every few minutes. Merchants across the country who needed gold to settle foreign contracts were being ruined in real time. Grant, who had received word from his own family about Corbin's involvement, acted. He ordered Treasury Secretary George S. Boutwell to release $4 million in government gold into the market. On the afternoon of September 24th, the price of gold fell from $160 to $133 within 15 minutes. Dozens of Wall Street brokerages collapsed that day. 150 more were effectively insolvent. The stock market fell 20%. The wheat market fell 50%. Foreign trade froze. The crash became known as Black Friday, though the specific date was a Thursday. What had happened to Gould in that interval is where the story pivots. I have read the Garfield Committee report, the congressional investigation into the conspiracy that ran through 1870, and the thing that stays with me is the timing. Gould had been quietly selling before the Treasury's intervention became public knowledge. Not afterward, during the collapse. Before, he had, at some point prior to the announcement, positioned himself on the opposite side of the trade he had been constructing for months. The men standing in the Gold Room buying at $160 were buying because they had been told, directly or through the network of representations Gould's scheme had constructed, that the government would not sell. When the government sold, they held paper claims on a price that no longer existed. Fisk repudiated his contracts entirely and paid nothing. Gould netted an estimated $11 to $12 million. His role was investigated, publicly documented, and essentially unpunished. The Garfield Committee cleared Grant personally of complicity, though it documented the use of his family members and political appointees in the scheme. Butterfield was removed from his position. Private litigation against Gould was settled at negotiated amounts. He continued operating. What Black Friday produced, beyond the $11 million, was the reputation. Joseph Pulitzer wrote that Gould was one of the most sinister figures that had ever flitted, bat-like, across the vision of the American people. Henry Adams wrote that Gould appeared to delight in deceiving everyone as to his intentions. The New York Times described him as an unscrupulous gambler who had never played without cogged dice. Gould read the press coverage and, by the available accounts, found it neither surprising nor particularly distressing. He was, by his own reckoning, a businessman. He was also, by anyone's reckoning, about to build something considerably larger. Subscribe if you want to see how this ends. Chapter 5. Lyndhurst. W.T. Stead, the British editor of the Review of Reviews, published a retrospective on Jay Gould in February of 1893, 2 months after Gould's death. The assessment was not, by the conventions of Victorian obituary writing, restrained. Stead wrote that Gould, with his 70 millions, was one of the colossal failures of our time. He was a purely selfish man, Stead wrote, whose greed consumed his charity, and who was like death and hell, gathering in all, giving back nothing. I want to sit with that for a moment, not to defend Gould, but to ask what category of failure Stead was describing. Because there is a legitimate argument, which the historical record partially supports, that Stead was measuring the wrong things. And there is an equally legitimate argument, which the same record supports just as well, that Stead was measuring the only things that matter. The question of which argument wins is not one this story has to settle. Both exist. Both are accurate. What the chapter has to do is establish what Gould actually built between Black Friday in 1869 and his death in 1892, so that the son who inherited it can be understood. After losing the Erie in 1872, Gould rebuilt, working from the depressed asset prices of the Panic of 1873. He took control of the Union Pacific, the Central Transcontinental Railroad, in 1873. He took control of the Missouri Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande in 1879. He acquired Western Union Telegraph Company in 1881 through a campaign of aggressive price competition from his own American Union Telegraph that drove Western Union to capitulate and accept acquisition. He acquired the Manhattan Elevated Railroad, the primary elevated transit system of New York City, also in 1881. By 1881, Jay Gould controlled approximately 15,800 miles of railroad, roughly 15% of the entire national network. He controlled the dominant telegraph company and the urban transit of the largest American city. No other individual in the 19th century had assembled anything of comparable breadth. In March of 1886, roughly 200,000 workers on his Southwestern Railroad network, organized by the Knights of Labor, walked out in what became the Great Southwest Railroad Strike. The numbers at that scale likely include sympathy strikers alongside the railway workers directly on his lines. The core walkout was concentrated on the Texas and Pacific, the Missouri Pacific, and the connecting roads through Arkansas, Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, and Texas. The strike began March 1st. By May, it was over. The strikers returned to work without their principal demands. It was the most significant defeat the Knights of Labor had ever suffered. and it effectively ended their vision of broad industrial unionism in the United States. The quotation attributed to Gould from that period, that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half, is traditional and dramatically effective, and not, by any source that has been located, something he said in 1886. The earliest documented version appeared in a Kansas People's Party newspaper in October of 1891, in a different form and in a different context. I include this not to rehabilitate Gould, but because the documented record of what he said is sufficiently revealing without supplementing it with things he may not have said. What he did say, in documented testimony to the New York State Senate, was that he was a Republican in Republican districts, a Democrat in Democratic ones, and doubtful in doubtful ones. An Erie railroad man always. Privately, Gould lived with a restraint that was, in its own way, as extreme as his public ruthlessness. He purchased the Gothic Revival mansion Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York, in 1880, a property originally built in 1838 for a former mayor of New York. He used it as a country retreat, traveling up the Hudson on the steam yacht Atalanta. He devoted himself almost entirely to Helen and their 6 children. He received almost no visitors outside his family and his bankers, kept armed guards around the estate at all hours, and made no philanthropic gestures of any note in his lifetime. He was not a man who gave anything back. Stead was accurate about that. Helen Gould died on January 13, 1889. Jay survived her by less than 4 years. He died of tuberculosis at his Manhattan mansion at 579 Fifth Avenue on December 2, 1892. He was 56 years old. His will was specific. The entire estate, conservatively valued at $72 million, went to his 6 children. Nothing went to servants, nothing went to charity, nothing went to anyone else. George received $15 million outright and operational control of the family's railroads. Edwin, Helen, Howard, Anna, and Frank each received $10 million. W.T. Stead had a point about the giving back. The man who received $15 million and the railroads on December 2, 1892, was 28 years old, charming, athletic, and a serious polo player. He had a wife, 2 young children, and a seat on the New York Stock Exchange that his father had purchased for him in his early 20s. His name was George J. Gould. What he decided to do with what he had received is the rest of this story. Chapter 6. The Heir. George J. Gould was born February 6, 1864, in Manhattan, the eldest of Jay and Helen Gould's 6 children. He was, by the accounts that survive, charming and athletic and popular in the way that first sons of very rich men sometimes are. He skipped college. Jay bought him a seat on the New York Stock Exchange in his early 20s, made him a director of multiple family companies, and in 1888 gave him his first independent management assignment, the Little Rock and Fort Smith Railway, a small line in Arkansas that was part of the family holdings and posed no particular challenges. On September 14, 1886, 6 years before his father's death, George married Edith Mary Kingdon at Lyndhurst, the Gould family estate on the Hudson. Edith was an actress, born in England and raised in New York, who had made a name on the stage. The marriage scandalized his mother Helen, to whom an actress was not an acceptable match for the eldest son of the most prominent family in American finance. Jay approved. The couple honeymooned on the steam yacht Atalanta. They would have 7 children. George's recreations, as he listed them to the press over the years, were yachting, polo, tennis, golf, hunting, fishing, and chess. He was a serious polo player and an active member of the Lakewood Country Club. He maintained a Manhattan mansion, the estate at Georgian Court, a hunting and fishing retreat in the Catskills, and the Atalanta. He dressed well. He entertained. He was, in the social columns of the period, a fixture. What he was not, in any documented account, was a man who read a railroad. The distinction matters. Jay Gould, according to the historian Maury Klein, who wrote the most serious biography of Jay in 1986, personally revised the financial structure of every company he controlled, waged every competitive struggle himself, captained every political battle, and knew every operational detail of every road he touched. He read freight statistics the way a musician reads a score. He knew which lines were losing traffic and why, which branch connections were underpriced, which agents were stealing. He never delegated the things that mattered. George delegated most things. Even before the panic of 1907, the consolidated Gould holdings under George's management shrank, per the family biographer E.P. Hoyt, from roughly $84 million to $50 million. The mechanics of that contraction are not easy to reconstruct in detail. The railroad properties were complex, the trust accounting was opaque, and the family's legal representatives were not forthcoming. What is clear is the direction: down, and over a period well before any external crisis made it inevitable. George had decided, roughly around 1900, to complete the one thing his father had tried and failed to build: a single railroad from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. 4 major trunk lines already existed. There was the Pennsylvania, running from New York to Chicago. There was the New York Central. There was the Baltimore and Ohio. There was the Erie. Against those 4, Jay had assembled a 5th system running through the center and west of the country. But it had never had an unbroken connection from the eastern seaboard to the Pacific coast. George would build it. The ambition was not unreasonable on its face. E.H. Harriman was consolidating the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific into a combined Pacific Empire. James J. Hill was extending the Great Northern and Northern Pacific across the Northern Corridor. Both men were operating on a scale that suggested a future of 2 or 3 dominant transcontinental systems. George's strategy was to be the 5th trunk, running through the center, coast to coast. He had the Missouri Pacific and the Texas and Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande at the center. He had the Western Maryland coming east toward Baltimore. He had the Wabash moving freight from the interior to Toledo and Chicago. What he needed was a reliable connection into Pittsburgh and a direct connection to the Pacific coast. He spent the next several years assembling both. The piece that required the most audacity was not the piece closest to his existing rails. It was the piece farthest away, on the other side of the Sierra Nevada, through a high mountain canyon that nobody had yet built a railroad through. This is the kind of story this channel makes. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Chapter 7. Feather River. The Western Pacific Railway was chartered on March 3, 1903, by a Sacramento attorney named Walter Bartnett and an engineer named Arthur Keddy, who had spent the better part of 30 years surveying a low-grade route through the Feather River Canyon of Northern California as the theoretical basis for a railroad to San Francisco Bay. Behind Bartnett and Keddy, as the dominant silent partner, was George J. Gould. The context requires a brief explanation. When E.H. Harriman acquired the Southern Pacific in 1901, he closed what railroad people called the Utah Gateway, the junction point that the Denver and Rio Grande used to connect its transcontinental traffic to Pacific ports. The effect was to trap the Denver and Rio Grande in the center of the country with no Pacific outlet. Harriman knew this, intended it, and was prepared to use it. George's transcontinental system, which ran from Baltimore through the Midwest and into the Rocky Mountain West was landlocked until he could find a route to the ocean that did not belong to Harriman or Hill. Keddy's Feather River Canyon route was that route. From the Salt Lake Valley westward, through the canyon of the Feather River in the Sierra Nevada, north of the main Sacramento River watershed, through the Niles Canyon south of San Francisco, to a terminal on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay at Oakland. 927 miles of new railroad across difficult terrain. The maximum grade was manageable. The curve geometry was workable. The construction was very expensive. George agreed to underwrite the project, and at his direction, $50 million in Western Pacific bonds were cross-collateralized against the assets of the Denver and Rio Grande. This was the financial structure that would later doom both lines simultaneously. The Denver and Rio Grande had pledged what it had in order to fund what the Western Pacific needed. And when the Western Pacific's bonds went into default, the Denver and Rio Grande's collateral went with them. The competition with Harriman was not only financial. His Southern Pacific, which already ran the established overland route through northern Nevada and across the Sierra Nevada, could offer shippers a faster, better capitalized, and more established service to the same California markets. The Western Pacific's competitive advantage was the Feather River grade, which was in some respects superior to the overland route on raw engineering metrics, a gentler grade capable of carrying heavier loads at lower fuel cost. Whether those engineering advantages would translate into traffic advantages in a market where the Southern Pacific had 40 years of established agent relationships and shipper familiarity was a question George had answered optimistically, and Harriman had answered the other way. The answer was not yet in when the last spike was driven. Construction began in the fall of 1905. The San Francisco earthquake of April 1906 damaged the construction works in the Niles Canyon section and set the timeline back by several months. Harriman fought the project at every available legal and regulatory mechanism. His Southern Pacific lieutenants reportedly threatened Gould personally at points during the construction period. 9,000 men were on the line by late 1907, at the same moment that the panic of 1907 was beginning to drain the financial system of the liquidity that had funded the project. I want to stay with Keddy, California for a moment. November 1st, 1909. The section foreman's name was Leonardo de Tomaso. He was 25 years old. He drove the last spike of the Western Pacific Railroad into a wooden tie on a bridge over Spanish Creek with a standard iron spike. No photographs survive of George Gould at the occasion. No company officers appear to have been present. The 927-mile line, which had cost approximately $75 million and 9,000 men several years of work through the Sierra Nevada, was completed in silence. This is not because the achievement was small. The Western Pacific was, by any reasonable engineering standard, one of the more significant accomplishments of the Gilded Age Railroad era. The Feather River Canyon section required sustained organizational effort and considerable courage from the men doing the blasting. By 1909, it was the last major transcontinental line built in the United States. What the silence suggests is something about 1909. The panic had already struck in 1907. The first receiverships had already begun. The Western Maryland had already gone under in March of 1908. The Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal had already gone under in May of 1908. The western anchor of the system was completed while the eastern anchors were already in the hands of receivers. In its final cost of approximately $75 million, the Western Pacific had consumed considerably more than George's entire original inheritance. He had raised the money through bonds and cross-collateralized assets. He had built what he set out to build. The question of what it was worth was about to receive a very specific answer. The next answer came in Pittsburgh. Chapter 8. The Terminal. The Wabash Terminal, downtown Pittsburgh, July 2, 1904. A new railroad passenger station in the center of the city, marble in the waiting room, a clock tower visible from the Monongahela River. The first passenger train departed that afternoon, passed through the Wabash Tunnel south of the river, crossed the new Wabash Bridge over the water, and headed west toward the Wabash system and, theoretically, the Atlantic coast. The terminal was the eastern anchor of Georgia's transcontinental. To get a Gould line into Pittsburgh, the center of American steel production and the most contested freight gateway in the northeastern United States, George had needed to fight the Pennsylvania Railroad for years, through the Pittsburgh City Council and courts. The Pennsylvania's political connections in the city ran deep. The opposition was effective enough that the project's permits were repeatedly delayed, adding costs and time the budget had not anticipated. When construction finally went forward, it went forward at enormous expense. The Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal Railway was chartered in 3 segments in 1900 and 1901 and consolidated on May 7, 1904. The cost of construction was $380,000 per mile, driven by the tunneling required to pass beneath the Pittsburgh Hills and the river bridge required to reach the downtown terminal from the south. One tunnel alone cost $3.5 million. A second tunnel collapsed when an old coal mine beneath it caved in during construction. 10 workmen died when a section of the Monongahela River Bridge fell during construction. George spent an additional $1 million on the passenger terminal itself, a large and architecturally serious building that was meant to announce the permanence of the Gould entry into Pittsburgh's freight market. Andrew Carnegie had agreed in advance to send 25% of his outbound steel freight tonnage over the new line. I want to sit with that detail for a moment. The entire Pittsburgh investment rested substantially on a prior agreement with one man. Carnegie had sold his steel interests to J.P. Morgan's United States Steel Company in 1899, before the terminal was finished. U.S. Steel had no particular obligation to honor commitments made by a company that no longer existed in its previous form. The freight that had been projected as the commercial basis for the entire Pittsburgh investment did not arrive. The terminal sat in downtown Pittsburgh, expensive and architecturally serious, serving traffic considerably below the level that would have made it financially viable. The man who had fought the Pennsylvania Railroad for years of permit battles had won the permits. He had built the tunnel. He had built the bridge. He had built the terminal. He had not gotten the freight. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which had spent years obstructing the construction, had correctly calculated that the construction alone would not be sufficient. What the terminal did attract in the years after its 1904 opening was modest and insufficient traffic from the smaller industrial shippers in the Pittsburgh region who wanted an alternative to the Pennsylvania Railroad's pricing. These were real customers, real tonnage, and real revenue. They were simply not the tonnage and revenue the investment had been sized to serve. George had built a freight gateway for Carnegie Steel. What he got was a freight gateway for smaller mills that the Pennsylvania had left room for as a safety valve. The difference was not trivial. The Pennsylvania's terminal on Penn Avenue was a different building in a different part of Pittsburgh. It served the actual freight patterns of a city the Pennsylvania had been shaping and channeling for 40 years. The Pennsylvania's rates were the only rates the Pittsburgh steel industry knew how to plan around, because the Pennsylvania was the railroad that had grown up alongside the steel industry. What Gould had built, at the cost of 20 workmen's lives and $3.5 million in one tunnel alone, was the infrastructure of an alternative that the market had not yet asked for. By the standards of what the Pittsburgh entry had been designed to accomplish, the terminal was a monument to a commercial assumption that turned out to be wrong. The assumption was that Carnegie's commitment would persist after Carnegie himself was gone. It did not. The terminal was beautiful. The tunnel was real. The bridge over the Monongahela stood. The freight had been promised, and it never arrived. By 1907, when the panic began, the Wabash-Pittsburgh terminal was operating below its break-even traffic level. The transcontinental system was now complete on paper from the Wabash Bridge in Pittsburgh to the bridge over Spanish Creek at Keddie, California. It was in trouble at both ends. The sequence of what came next was dated, almost to the week. If you are still watching at this point, you are who this channel is for. Subscribe, and these will keep coming. Chapter 9. The Cascade. The March 23, 1925 issue of Time magazine ran a profile of Edwin Gould, the second of Jay's sons. The profile summarized his elder brother's career in one sentence. George Jay, the eldest son, it said, undertook to complete his father's transcontinental system and muffed it. 2 words. This was the verdict of the business press, delivered 2 years after George's death, on a career that had consumed 2 decades and most of a $72 million fortune. The editors of Time found the whole thing disposable in a subordinate clause. The sequence, dated March 5, 1908. The Western Maryland Railroad, the easternmost component of the Gould Transcontinental, entered receivership. A new corporation, the Western Maryland Railway Company, was formed in 1909 by its creditors. May 29, 1908, the Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal Railway entered receivership, ending through traffic between Pittsburgh and the Wabash system. The tunnel and the bridge and the million-dollar terminal were now in the hands of a receiver. They were sold at foreclosure in August of 1916 and reorganized as the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railway. 1911. George Gould was ousted from the presidency of the Missouri Pacific, the crown of the family's railroad holdings, and replaced by Benjamin F. Bush. I want to stop on that moment. Bush arrived from a position at a different road, and when reporters came to his new office, he told them he had cut the wire between his desk and the Gould offices in New York. Not merely severed the professional relationship, cut the wire. The specific physical act of removing the communications connection and describing it to the press in those terms. That is what the end of a dynasty looks like from the outside. Not a collapse, not a drama, but a new man in a St. Louis office making a single announcement about telecommunications. December 26, 1911. The Wabash Railroad, the central east-west trunk of the Gould system, connecting Toledo and St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago, entered receivership. October 22, 1915. The Wabash was sold at foreclosure and reorganized as the Wabash Railway, with operations transferring November 1st, August 19, 1915. The Missouri Pacific and the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern entered receivership by order of a federal court, and were reorganized in March of 1917 as the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company. 1915. The Western Pacific Railway defaulted on its mortgage bonds and entered receivership. The Denver and Rio Grande, which had pledged its assets as collateral for the Western Pacific bonds at Georgia's direction in 1903, followed it into receivership. Both were eventually sold. Even before the final receiverships, George had sought outside capital. John D. Rockefeller had provided bridge financing at a critical period in the system's decline. The precise terms are not fully part of the public record. It was not sufficient. The system was over-leveraged in a structure where each defaulting property put the next one in jeopardy. And no amount of outside capital could have unwound that cross-collateralization quietly. By 1918, all the roads were lost. In 1916, before the last receiverships had been finalized, George's younger siblings, Frank J. Gould and Anna Gould, filed suit against the 4 trustees of their father's estate, alleging gross mismanagement and self-dealing that had cost the trust tens of millions of dollars. The litigation ran 11 years. A judgment for $50 million was entered against the trustees. It was settled by compromise at $20 million. George had been dead 4 years before the settlement was signed. The personal chronology ran alongside the financial one. On November 13, 1921, Edith Mary Kingdon Gould was found collapsed on the 9th tee of the private 9-hole golf course that George had built at Georgian Court. She died there. She had been married to George for 35 years and had borne him 7 children. By some accounts, derived from press coverage at the time rather than from any medical documentation, she was wearing a constricting rubber undergarment from ankle to neck. No published autopsy or corroborating medical source for this specific detail has been located. It circulates in the social history literature as reported fact. George had, at this point, been conducting a relationship for several years with a young woman named Guinevere Jean Sinclair, born in Westfield, Iowa, in 1885, who was performing in London under the stage name Vere Sinclair in the musical comedy The Girl on the Film at the Gaiety Theatre. George had first housed her on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, then on a property on Manursing Island near Rye, New York, where he arrived on weekends by yacht. They had 3 children: George Sinclair, born 1915, Jane Sinclair, born 1916, and a daughter, Guinevere, born 1922. On May 1, 1922, 6 months after Edith's death, George Gould married Guinevere Sinclair in a private ceremony at a judge's home in Lakewood, New Jersey. 3 witnesses attended. His older children were not among them. In early 1923, George and his new wife traveled to Egypt. The tomb of Tutankhamun had been opened in November of 1922, and the organized tourism that followed was the global story of the moment. George contracted a fever during the visit. He moved to his villa at Roquebrune Cap Martin on the French Riviera, a property he called Villa Zoraide, where the fever worsened into pneumonia. He died on May 16, 1923. Lord Carnarvon, the British aristocrat who had financed the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb, had died of an infected mosquito bite in April of 1923. The international press, saturated with Toot mania since November, made a connection. The phrase "Curse of the Pharaohs" appeared in newspapers from London to San Francisco. George Gould, the heir to one of the great Gilded Age fortunes, had visited a dead Egyptian king and died 4 months later. The actual cause of death was pneumonia. He was 59 years old. Chapter 10. The Probate George J. Gould's. New York estate was filed in the courts in the years following his May 1923 death. The gross value was determined to be $15,054,627. After debts, the settlement of the family trust judgment, and 4 years of litigation among his 10 children, 7 by Edith and 3 by Guinevere, the net was $5,175,590. His father had left $72 million. His share of that had been $15 million. He had been trusted with the operational control of the largest railroad network the family had ever assembled. The mathematics of what remained is the story's central data point. The 5 siblings who outlived George took their inheritances in 5 different directions. Helen Miller Gould Shepherd was, by the standards of what Gilded Age fortunes typically produced, unusual. She was quietly pious, consistently philanthropic, and unconcerned with social display. In 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain, Helen gave $100,000 to the federal government toward the war effort and an additional $50,000 toward military hospital supplies. She funded the Gould Memorial Library at New York University. She adopted 3 children. She married, at 44, a man named Finley Johnson Shepherd. In 1918, she became, with Emma Baker Kennedy, one of the first 2 female vice presidents of the American Bible Society. She was the Gould who found a way to make the money do something. Edwin Gould was the practical one. He attended Columbia for 3 years before leaving for Wall Street, served as president of the St. Louis Southwestern Railway, managed his inheritance with restraint, and founded the Edwin Gould Foundation for Children. He died at Oyster Bay in July of 1933, with his inheritance largely intact. Howard Gould built a 100,000-square-foot castle on Long Island, modeled on Kilkenny Castle in Ireland, at a reported cost of $1.7 million. His wife, Catherine, who had been an actress and was reportedly previously the companion of Buffalo Bill Cody, declared the finished product fit only for a stable. Howard built the 50,000-square-foot Tudor Revival Hempstead House next door. The Goulds separated in 1907 and divorced in a sensational trial in 1909. He sold the property to Daniel Guggenheim in 1917 and spent most of the rest of his life in Europe. Anna Gould married Count Boniface de Castellane in March of 1895. Castellane spent roughly $10 million of her fortune over the 11 years of the marriage, the centerpiece being the Palais Rose on the Avenue Foch in Paris, before Anna divorced him in 1906. In 1908, she married his cousin Hélie de Talleyrand-Périgord, the 5th Duke of Talleyrand, becoming the Duchesse de Talleyrand-Périgord. She died in Paris in 1961. Frank J. Gould took his $10 million to the French Riviera and built a hotel empire. The Palais de la Méditerranée Casino in Nice, the 290-room Hotel Provençal and casino in Juan-les-Pins, properties at Cannes and elsewhere. He reportedly grew his inheritance from $10 million to something in the vicinity of $100 million. The Pinade Gould Park in Juan-les-Pins is named for him. He died on April 1, 1956. What the Gould estate left physically, Lyndhurst, the Gothic Revival mansion in Tarrytown, now administered by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The Gould Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, designed without any external identification by Jay Gould's specific instruction. Castle Gould and Hempstead House at Sands Point, now a county nature preserve. The Pinade Gould in Juan-les-Pins. Georgian Court in Lakewood, New Jersey. I want to step back from the estate filings. It would be easy to read this as a story about a bad son who failed his father's legacy. That is not what this is. What strikes me, having spent the time I have spent with this material, is that George Gould was not incompetent. He built the Western Pacific. He punched into Pittsburgh. He assembled the only Atlantic to Pacific railroad system the Gilded Age ever produced that was not already controlled by Harriman or Hill. He did the thing. The thing happened to require instincts that are not inheritable. The ability to read a freight pattern before the freight exists, to know when the money is on the wrong side of a bet, to feel the panic before it arrives. Jay Gould had those instincts. He built them in Roxbury, New York, on a dairy farm, carrying groceries in a blacksmith's shop, watching the 1857 panic destroy his first partner. What survived is the frame. Lyndhurst still stands on the Hudson, a Gothic revival mansion administered by the National Trust. The Gould Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx carries no name on its exterior, by Jay Gould's instruction. Frank Gould's casino in Juan-les-Pins is a park now. Anna Gould's descendants are French. Helen Gould's library at New York University still bears the name. What did not survive is the fortune. The 95% that George spent chasing his father's unfinished ambition is the data point this story has been building toward. Georgian Court is now Georgian Court University, a Catholic liberal arts college in Lakewood, New Jersey. The Italian Sunken Garden is a campus landmark. The Apollo marble fountain is still there, the one George commissioned, reportedly as a birthday gift for Edith in 1900, sculpted in Italy, shipped across the Atlantic. The grass where the boys in 15th century armor moved across a chessboard at George Gould's direction is a parking lot. I think about that parking lot often. A man who inherited $15 million and spent it trying to build something larger than himself did not leave a university or a library or a hospital behind. He left a parking lot in Lakewood, New Jersey, on the grounds of an estate he commissioned from a Toronto architect as a gift to the woman he would later neglect, to the point that she died in a rubber undergarment on a golf course. The lawn was beautiful. The chess game was elaborate. The fortune was $72 million. Jay Gould left not $1 to the public and was called the worst man in America. His son left the largest railroad system the Gilded Age ever attempted and died with $5,175,590. Georgian Court University holds commencement on the polo fields in May. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.